The Raiders had a rough minicamp day, and if you've been following the coverage, you already know that. But I'd be doing you a disservice if I let the headline version of this story be the one that sticks. Because there's what the box score of a practice session tells you, and then there's what actually happened when you watch the whole picture. And I'm telling you right now, those two things are pulling in very different directions after what went down in Las Vegas this week. Fernando Mendoza struggled. I'm not going to soften that or spin it into something it wasn't. His accuracy was inconsistent. The pass rush got into his face and won those matchups. Malcolm Koonce and J.J. Pagas both had sessions that, if you're converting them to real game scenarios, end in sacks. Aiden O'Connell threw an interception. The quarterback room as a collective unit had the kind of afternoon that lights up fan forums and sends beat writers sprinting for the hot take factory. And listen, I get it. I genuinely do. Raider Nation has been through enough cycles of optimism collapsing into disappointment that the instinct to read every negative sign as a prophecy of doom isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition. It's earned. The fan base has paid for that instinct with years of heartbreak. But something happened after that practice that I can't stop thinking about. Something that the quick hit summary coverage either didn't notice or didn't know how to value. And honestly, it's the part of this whole mini camp that matters the most to me going forward, because it told me something about Fernando Mendoza that no statistical line from a practice session ever could. When Mendoza faced the reporters after that session, he didn't do what most young quarterbacks do in that situation. He didn't give you the reassuring non-answer. He didn't reach for the comfortable platitudes about grinding harder and trusting the process and keeping his head down. He was specific. He was direct. He named exactly what went wrong, and then he explained, calmly, clearly, with the kind of precision you don't usually get from a 22-year-old before his first NFL regular season snap, the internal system he already has in place to make sure that bad afternoon doesn't compound into something worse. He talked about reviewing his notes at night and charting the patterns in his errors before they have a chance to calcify into habits. He talked about the trap of playing tight, that specific suffocating mental state where the fear of making a mistake becomes the very mechanism that produces the mistake, because your natural instincts are having to force their way through a wall of anxiety before they can express themselves. Every quarterback who has ever played under pressure in a stadium full of people knows exactly what that feeling is. The great ones just usually can't articulate it until they're well into their 30s and looking back at the years they lost to it. Mendoza articulated it now, before he's played a single snap that matters, and that changed something in my read of this situation. Here's what I think gets misunderstood about mental toughness in football. The version that gets celebrated in locker room culture, the shake it off, show nothing, never let them see it hurt version, that has its place. I'm not dismissing it. But the version that actually separates the quarterbacks who make it from the ones who don't isn't about the absence of visible distress. It's about what happens in private, in the hours after the bad performance, when nobody's watching and the weight of the mistakes is sitting on you. The quarterbacks who flame out in this league, the ones with every physical tool who still can't stick, almost none of them fail because they can't throw the ball. They fail because bad days follow them, because one interception becomes a cloud over the next third down decision, because the accumulation of doubt slowly shifts their decision-making from instinct to fear. And once you're playing from fear in this league, you are already behind in every situation that matters. The mental infrastructure to prevent that, the internal process for honestly examining failure without being consumed by it, that either exists inside a player or it doesn't. You cannot install it from the outside. A coordinator can build you a scheme. A position coach can refine your footwork and your release. A strength program can make you faster and more durable. But the architecture of how you handle the hard moment in the quiet of your own mind, that has to already be there. It's there in Mendoza. I saw it in how he stood in front of those reporters and talked. Not defensively, not with the glazed over vacancy of a guy saying the right words while thinking about something else entirely, with actual awareness. And when a 22-year-old already has that kind of relationship with his own failure, the ability to look at it directly and extract the lesson rather than flinch away from it, you are watching someone who is going to be very difficult to break. Now let me make the football argument alongside the psychological one, because I don't want this to read like I'm just running emotional cover for a bad practice. There's a tactical reality here worth understanding. Mendoza wasn't getting live reps against soft coverage and passive pass rushers during minicamp. The defensive personnel he was working against were guys this coaching staff expects to be starting in September, first-team players competing with legitimate intensity. That's the environment by design. That's what minicamp at this level is built for. If Mendoza had gone out there and looked flawless in every session with reporters watching, with the starting defense going full speed, I'd actually be less confident in what I was seeing, because it would suggest either the defense wasn't taking it seriously or the scenarios weren't realistic enough to reveal anything meaningful. The entire purpose of this process is pressure. The entire value of it is finding the specific places where a young quarterback isn't good enough yet, so that those places can be worked on in the training room and the film room and on the practice field before they become problems in a Week 3 game with real consequences. The fact that Mendoza got exposed in certain areas during minicamp is not an alarm. It's the system functioning correctly. And the response to that exposure, calm, honest, analytical, forward-looking, is the thing that tells you whether the system is working in the right player. Let me get to Kirk Cousins now, because the narrative that's formed around him feels like it's being driven more by the desire for a clean story than by what's actually there. The take making the rounds is basically, Cousins watching from the sideline during team periods is the visual proof that he's becoming a ceremonial presence in this building, a legacy piece on his way out rather than a real competitive factor. And I understand why that framing is tempting. It's a clean arc, veteran fades, rookie rises, cycle of the league completes itself. But I think it misses something important about what Cousins actually represents to this quarterback room. Kirk Cousins has navigated complex offensive systems for over a decade at the highest competitive level in professional football. He's been in playoff environments. He has rebuilt himself after serious injury. He has experienced public failure and come back from it. That biography is not decoration. That is a living reference library for a 22-year-old quarterback who is about to face every one of those experiences for the first time in his career and face them with everything on the line. There is a version of the NFL learning curve that happens the brutal way, in real games, under real pressure, with real consequences attached to every miscalculation. And there is a version where a young quarterback gets to have those conversations in advance with someone who's already paid every price the league charges. Mendoza gets the second version. He gets to sit in film rooms and walk through practice with someone who has seen the exact situations Mendoza will face, made the mistakes Mendoza might make, and survived them. That is a competitive advantage that will never show up in any efficiency metric or depth chart graphic, but it will absolutely show up in how Mendoza handles his first serious stretch of adversity when the season is real and the margin for error is gone. Now here's the part of this mini camp that I think is genuinely underreported, and it's the part that has me most fired up about where this team is actually going: the defense. Specifically what Rob Leonard is constructing on that side of the ball, and more specifically, the specific player who is sitting at the philosophical center of that construction. Quay Walker's name is appearing in every substantive practice report out of this camp. Not as a footnote, not as depth filler dropped into a paragraph between injury updates. He is consistently at the center of the most meaningful defensive descriptions coming out of these sessions. And when I started paying close attention to the language Leonard is using around him, I leaned in hard. The word Leonard used was avatar. That is not a casual word in the context of defensive scheme design. An avatar is a player who can authentically perform multiple defensive functions, not a player who lines up in different spots while always doing essentially the same thing, but a player whose presence forces an offensive coordinator to prepare for several genuinely different threats simultaneously because he can actually deliver on all of them. That is an entirely different level of defensive value. When you build a unit with players like that distributed across multiple positions, you become a defense that is structurally hard to prepare for. You can eliminate a threat in a film session. You can account for a tendency. You can scheme around a predictable alignment. You can exploit a player who's always going to be in the same place, doing the same thing, regardless of what you show him. You cannot eliminate a threat that changes shape based on formation and context and down and distance, because there's no single answer to prepare when the question itself keeps shifting. The uncertainty an offense has to carry into the huddle when they can't confidently identify what they're looking at before the snap. That is one of the most valuable defensive commodities in modern football, and Leonard appears to be deliberately manufacturing it. Walker talked about what's being asked of him in this system, and what he said mattered to me. He's being used in more alignments than at any point in his career. For most players, that kind of expanded demand triggers a private anxiety. The stretched feeling of being pulled across too many responsibilities without the depth to truly master any of them. Walker described it as the thing he's been working toward his whole career. He talked about always wanting to be the kind of linebacker who can affect a game from multiple spots on the field, rather than being permanently assigned to a single predetermined role. That attitude is not just psychologically healthy for Walker as an individual. It is practically essential for a defense trying to build genuine schematic identity around this kind of complexity. You can diagram the most sophisticated system in the league on a whiteboard, but if the players running it are doing it mechanically, following assignments without truly understanding why the assignments exist or what the design is trying to accomplish. It collapses the instant an offense does something unexpected. What makes it work is players who are genuinely curious about the complexity, genuinely energized by the challenge of mastering something difficult, rather than just executing something familiar. Walker's investment in this responsibility is exactly what a defense in this phase of identity formation needs from a player with his physical tools. Jeremy Chin and Taron Johnson are getting mentioned in similar contexts. Versatile deployment, multiple coverage alignments, the kind of pre-snap ambiguity that prevents an offensive quarterback from arriving at the line of scrimmage with a clean picture of what he's about to face. And when you start connecting those individual descriptions across multiple players on the same unit, you stop seeing a collection of depth pieces and you start seeing the emergence of a genuine defensive philosophy. The Raiders' defense in recent years was a defense you could read before the ball was snapped. Offenses could identify coverage structures, locate pressure angles, and settle into their decision-making with a level of pre-snap comfort that no defense should willingly surrender to a good offense. What Leonard is building appears to be specifically designed to take that comfort away, to put offensive coordinators in a position where the problems they need to solve cannot be fully resolved in the film session the night before and have to be figured out in real time with a clock running and 50,000 people making noise. That transition from a defense that executes assignments to a defense that manufactures confusion is one of the most consequential things a rebuilding team can invest in. And it is being built right now, in these practice sessions, in a way that the surface-level minicamp coverage is almost completely missing. Cody Lindenberg deserves a mention here, and I'm not going to let it pass. With Nico Dean sitting out, Lindenberg has been running with the first-team linebacker group, and what's being reported about him is not a player keeping a spot warm until the regular rotation comes back. He's making plays. He's earning specific, genuine recognition from the coaches and observers watching these sessions. A 7th-round pick, genuinely competing for meaningful depth chart consideration when real roster decisions get made in training camp. That's not a small thing. That's the culture of competition a coaching staff is trying to build, showing up in practice. When nothing is predetermined, when every spot has to be earned regardless of draft pedigree or prior reputation, the floor across the entire roster rises. That's what accountability looks like when it's operational rather than theoretical. The absences of Dean and Jermaine McCoy generated some noise in the coverage, and I want to be straightforward about it. The coaching staff has been clear. Both situations are routine off-season management, no significant concern, both expected to be fully resolved before training camp carries real weight. Turning a managed absence into a crisis narrative when the people who actually have the relevant information are telling you there's nothing there is not analysis. It's noise pretending to be insight, and Raider Nation doesn't need more of that. Brandon Johnson is the last piece I want to address because the reaction to him has been split between unrealistic enthusiasm and unfair dismissal. Released by Pittsburgh after 2 seasons there and 1 prior stint in Denver, Johnson is not the proven WR1 presence a vocal portion of this fan base has been pushing for. And I'd rather say that directly than soften it, but the details underneath that surface read are worth examining. Johnson worked under Kubiak in Denver, and wide receiver coach Zach Azzani has a professional relationship with him going back to recruiting at Tennessee and through multiple subsequent stops. In a league where roster decisions get made under constant time pressure, shared professional history that deep has real practical value. There's no orientation period. Johnson arrives in training camp already fluent in what this staff expects. His production profile, 26 catches, 335 yards, 5 touchdowns across 23 professional games, averaging close to 15 yards per catch in his best Denver season, points to a receiver with genuine big play upside when given actual opportunity. The red zone dimension his size creates is a separate accounting problem for defenses. He probably doesn't start, but the combination of staff familiarity and legitimate downfield ability makes this a sensible, low-drama depth add. And if he doesn't make the 53-man roster, those same relationships keep him accessible on the practice squad when the injury attrition that always comes in a long season starts opening doors. Here's where I actually land when I pull back and look at all of it together. I didn't come into this week expecting anything that would meaningfully shift my read on where this franchise is heading. I expected a standard mini-camp cycle, useful information mixed with noise, nothing that dramatically changed the picture. That's not what I got. What I got was a young quarterback who took a difficult afternoon, got tested hard by a competitive defense, and then stood in front of reporters and gave me a more honest and analytically precise account of his own mental framework than I expected from anyone at this stage of their development. I got a defensive coordinator who appears to be building something with genuine structural ambition, rather than just assembling competent players around a conventional scheme. I got a linebacker in Key Walker, who has not only the physical profile to be a schematic weapon, but the specific mindset and appetite for complexity that a system like this actually requires to function. I got depth players competing with real intensity and making real cases for themselves. And underneath all of it, I got a sense of organizational texture and accountability and a philosophical consistency coming from the coaching staff that points towards something more grounded and more authentic than what this franchise has produced in recent memory. Mendoza's rough afternoon is the smallest part of this story. The defense taking shape around him is the largest, and the details that aren't generating headlines, Walker's attitude toward his role, a 22-year-old quarterback's existing framework for processing failure, the identity a coordinator is deliberately and intentionally constructing on that side of the ball. Those are the things that will determine what this team becomes when the games are real and the margin for error disappears. Training camp is coming. The joint practices against the Texans are coming. Everything being built right now. In these sessions, the polished and the messy and the quietly significant is the foundation those moments will be built on.